Okay, well, conflict management students, I wanted to continue our discussion about conflict management theories, and this comes right out of your textbook, and these are the interpersonal conflict theories. Okay, we're going to talk about social exchange theory, and we're going to talk about systems theory, and how they offer some explanation when it comes to conflict, and potentially some predictive value when it comes to conflict. Okay? So let's start off with social exchange theory, okay? I think what's important to remember about social exchange theory is that you are evaluating your relationship, just, it could be a friendship, a significant other, based on rewards and costs. So for instance, the idea behind social exchange theory is that if you feel like a person is just taking too much energy, this is the cost, okay? And maybe, you always have to lend them money. Maybe you always have to drive them around. Maybe they are, they lie to you too and you can't trust them. And the rewards, well, they're kind of fun and they like the same movies you like. And, at some point when the costs are significantly weightier, or there are more costs than the rewards, it is going to make you feel like you have to do something about that relationship. And generally speaking, it leads to more conflict. And so that's really where social exchange theory comes into play, is this scale. I'm going to be doing this when we talk about social exchange theory, the costs outweighing the rewards. Okay? And when that happens, it's going to lead to some decision making, which, as we know in psychodynamic theory, that leads to some tension internally in your mind. And then, of course, that tension is not, there's no closure until you make a decision about this relationship. Okay? So social exchange theory is where you're evaluating your relationships based on costs and rewards. So a lot of times people will talk about relationships in terms of energy. Like, we have a limited amount of energy, and is this friendship worth the energy it's taking? That's an important question, because if it's not, then we're going to have to make some decisions. Okay, what do I gain from continuing to hang out with this person? And you're looking at benefits and this scale. And really, the comparison level is what we're establishing. Okay, so for instance, most of you will hang on to a relationship, whether it's a friendship or a significant other, where the rewards hopefully are outweighing the costs. Okay, and I'm not talking about money. We're talking about opportunity costs, right? You choose to spend time with people. You prioritize spending time with, for instance, a significant other over your friends. And so there's an opportunity cost, but spending time with your friends. So if the rewards, some people, if it's pretty even, maybe you hang on to that relationship. But some folks, if your self-esteem is a little bit low, and maybe you have friends who really have, they don't really think highly of themselves. They don't value themselves as much as they should. They have lower self-esteem. They'll put up with more costs than rewards. They'll hang on to that relationship probably longer than they should, because they don't think that they deserve that much. And that's really what we're talking about as comparison level in social exchange theory, is that, usually there's a point where there's going to be conflict because the costs outweigh. But it depends on the person's self-esteem and how they value themselves too. So a lot of times, we feel like the comparison level raises, that we think a relationship's more satisfying as there are more rewards to the relationship. Okay? So that's social exchange theory. If we were in class, I'd ask you these questions and we'd talk about it, but I'll save this for a discussion board. How do you evaluate the quality of an interpersonal relationship? And when do you know it's time to leave? Okay? How many more costs, how weightier does the costs need to be compared to the rewards? Well, let's turn our attention to systems theory. And this will be the last theory we talk about that's written in your textbook. I have a couple others that I'd like to discuss that are not in the textbook. But systems theory, if you think about a system, that there are components that are interrelated. And what does interrelated mean? That means they are affected by each other. So if you think about your family as you're growing up, if something happened to one of the family members, maybe it's the breadwinner, obviously that's going to impact you all. Okay? It's going to create change, perhaps. Maybe you're going to have to move to a neighborhood that is less expensive if someone loses a job, right? And so I think that's the idea, is that when there's change, it leads to, or potentially leads to, conflict. When you have major change in your life, think about it. When you have moved, when you have gone through your teenage years and you started to change, you started to want to be more independent, and maybe a parent figure felt like, oh my gosh, I can't believe how rebellious you are. All you want to do is, as a person, is show that you're growing up, right? Be more independent. Well, that's a significant change. And so systems theory, when it's related to conflict management, is predictive in a way that says, if there's major change in your life and you have interrelated components, you have loved ones, family members, friends, etc., you're probably more likely to have conflict. Okay? So when you have moved, has that caused conflict? When you decided to go to school, did that lead to conflict in your life? Okay? When you decided to break up with somebody, did that lead to conflict with your friends? Because they really liked the person you broke up with, and they were interrelated. So that's really what we're talking about, is that these environmental changes, and that's important to remember, is that change is constant, right? Change is constant, and conflict is inevitable, and change generally impacts the amount of conflicts you have and sometimes the intensity of the conflicts you have. All right, well, I'm glad I got to explain these last two theories that are listed in your textbook. If you have any questions, please, not text me, but email me and Zoom in if you have any questions. I'd really be happy to answer them. And have a good day.